Hello again, investors. And today we're going to review a place called Ashton, Under Lyne, which is just northwest of Manchester. We're going to give it some scores and then give it a final thumbs up or thumbs down for buy to let. So let's get into it. So the first thing is we've got the spreadsheet, and as you see here, I've got the variables, and I'll just explain what they are and why they're significant. Location, as in just roughly how the property sits in relation to places people want to be. And that could be employment, could be local environment, whatever. This is demographics, a really important topic. And by the way, you can see I've got various weightings. So that means I've prioritized things to one level or another. But demographics is really just the information about the people in the area. And we use a number of metrics. Amongst them is the social grade that they have. Then we're going to look at crime. With crime, it's important not to generalize too much. So we're going to look at various patches within Ashton Under Lyne and just see what the crime looks like, and then we can kind of take an overview assessment. But importantly, you should always take crime on a case-by-case basis. Now the next thing is capital growth. That is really one of the fundamentals to making the deal work, and we want to know if the capital growth is expected to keep ahead of inflation. Then the next one is how long it takes to sell something. That's quite important because if you want to exit, you probably want to move along fairly quickly, i.e. sell time effectively represents liquidity of your wealth. And rent time, just how long the voids will be. Obviously the lower the rent time, the lower the time to rent, should I say, the less void periods you have, and therefore the more money you're going to make. And finally, yield. This is just gross yield, so that is percentage of percentage. And finally, we've got gross yield, and that is rental yield against cost of acquisition or the sale. And finally, we've got rental yield, and that one is cost of property or sale price of property, should I say, against the rent, and you end up with a percentage. So we're just looking for areas that yield well, but in context with the rest of these other variables. And then we have a scoring system. Got the stars here to make it nice and visual, and then we've got this. Now, very important, if I go 0 on any one thing, then that's kind of it. So it's important because all of these have to work, and if crime levels are absolutely unacceptable or the yield doesn't work, then the area doesn't work. So why would I give it any more than a 0 if it's just not going to work for you? And the very first thing we're going to look at is location. I've got a Google Maps here, and I've set it up beforehand so you can just see roughly how. Let's just disable that. We can then see roughly how far it is from Manchester City, and you can see here that it's around 9 kilometers, 9 kilometers thereabouts. And I've assumed that we're taking a distance measurement from the town centre. Now, as you'll see later on, the town centre is not the place to buy property. So I've just taken a travel time from one of the areas that would be a little bit better potentially. And we can see here that we can see here that if I go by car, it's going to take half an hour. Public transport, 50 minutes. Now that assumes that you've got to get a bus from some location or other and then get the train into the town centre. This is a big issue with Ashton Under Lyne because, as you'll see in this map, the travelling to work one, the big problem with this town is that the people who commute by train live, or public transport, live town centre, and then the further out you live, the more likely you are to drive cars. And so what you're looking for, by the way, is red is where they drive cars or van to work, and cream colour is where they tend not to drive by car. So they're just going to get to work some other way. But the facilities for getting into central Manchester are not so great. Now, one of the other questions is, what about green space and parks and its proximity to interesting features like the hills and so on? And in my view, it doesn't do so great either. It's a reasonably large town. There is some encroachment of green space, which is nice. But overall, I don't think it's not great on location. So I'm going to give it a fairly low score. I'm going to give it a 2.5 on location. The next question is around demographics. You're most likely to find the best tenant who is going to be social grade C1. And the reason for this is that the upper middle classes and the middle classes, if they can afford it, they're going to buy their own property. But you get these lower middle classes who have secure jobs, reasonable income, but they just haven't quite got there with saving up for their own property. And these are the people who are really the most attractive tenants. When you get down to C2, that's still good. But people who are skilled manual workers, often they might work in a factory, but very often they work ad hoc. And then D and E are economically precarious. This is all really important stuff when you look at the makeup of an area. Now, I'll show you one of the things that I always look for is the proportion of the population who are not social grade DE. And what we have here is all the metrics, the main demographic metrics. We're looking for the proportion who are socially renting, who are social DE, and who speak good English. And also, of course, I forgot to say, who are economically active, i.e. they work. And the reason all these things are important added up is not because you might not want a tenant who is of that profile, but simply the people who are economically robust and productive probably don't want to live in these kind of areas that are dominated by this kind of demographic. And there's a very simple rule on this. People always aspire to live in a better area, or most always aspire to buy the best house they can or live in the nicest area or whatever, because an area represents their self-realization. It's kind of psychology stuff. Therefore, when you look at the demographics for this town, what you find is that you've got the shopping areas and so on. You've got a lot of social housing and a lot of poverty really in the core of the town. And what that means, if you remember about the public transport issues, is that if you buy a property out here, for example, which has good demographics, but may not have great public transport accessibility, then you're going to lose the opportunity to rent to a larger market. Because ultimately the goal for a buy-to-let landlord is rent out to the most people you could possibly rent to, and make sure that they're the best people, the most economically stable people you can find who have the most disposable income. So again, just reiterating, the formula is biggest market possible with the most income possible that need to rent. And if you find that perfect confluence, then you are going to do well with your buy-to-let property. Now, the issue here with Ashton Under Lyne, as I've said, is that you're excluding a large part of your market just simply because the people who want to, the people who could get public transport don't want to live here, because it takes longer to get from here into central Manchester than it does from, say, Stalybridge, which has a much nicer town centre and is just generally easier for central Manchester. The other thing that's worth looking at is the ratio of privately rented properties. And when you look at the demographics here, and we go out to this area here, the proportions are relatively low, like 5-12%. Now, as a general rule, I think if you can have, say, 15% of the population and more, up to maybe 30-40 who are privately renting, that's okay. Okay, let's give this area a score. And I'm going to say that the demographics are around 2.5, and that's because I give it a mixture. I give it a plus on the outskirts looking good. When you look at the overall makeup of the town, on average, I would say the demographics aren't really that healthy. Now, the next thing is crime. And when we zoom in on crime, the thing to bear in mind with crime data is that it's very localized. So, as I constantly say, you can have an area with good demographics and a lot of crime, and conversely, bad demographics, very little crime. Here, for example, is the kind of crime that one should really watch out for. So the demographics in this area are reasonably okay. Not too much DE, and quite a high proportion of privately rented, and quite a reasonable proportion of people socially employed. But in this little spot, which looks like some sort of store or something like that, yeah, it's on near a supermarket, we've got a lot of crime. Now, this kind of crime I'm not too concerned about, because you get a lot of throughput here, and the key is to look at crime in terms of crimes per 1,000 people, and the crimes per 1,000 people will probably be relatively low. However, what would concern me are areas like this, where you've got a quiet residential spot and you've got a lot of crime. Then it means that there's some family or group of people who commit crimes locally and make life very unpleasant for the people around them. Anyhow, if we zoom out a little bit on Ashton Under Lyne, one of the things that I've noticed is that it's okay on crime. It's not especially high. There isn't widespread crime, so I'm going to give it a fairly reasonable score. I'm going to give it a 3.5. I think there are some issues in the overall area, but remember, you've got to take crime on a literally a street by street basis. However, the caveat is, if you see lots of street crime across a wide area, then that's a problem. Now, the next question is, how's the place looking on capital growth? To give you some context on how I analyze growth, here we've got the house price affordability going back to 1845. And the reason this is significant is because back in, say, 1845, if you wanted to own a property, it would have cost you around 13 times your annual wages. Then it dropped just after the First World War, peaked just after the Second World War, but peaked in a major way in 2007. So 15 years ago is a good time span to get a sense of how an area has done economically since that high water mark. And the way I analyze this is I look at it in terms of inflation adjusted house price. So here we've got an inflation calculator. If you had bought a place in 2007 for 100,000 and you were to buy the same property today in terms of purchasing power, so 100,000 buys you whatever it buys you back then, and it buys you, and you want to buy the same thing or the equivalent things today, then you would have to spend £141,000 in today's money. So therefore, if a property has gone up by zero, i.e., or should I say an area, if an area has gone up by 0 or 1%, then in real terms, the property has essentially stood still in value. So therefore, what one is looking for are areas that have grown in real terms. So this property here has grown in real terms by 20%. And that's good. So if you bought that in 2007, you would be 20% wealthier in real terms because your house has gone up in value 20% ahead of inflation. Anyhow, now you understand the numbers. In real terms, this area here, which we saw earlier, which has really distressed demographics, I'll go back here and we'll go DE. This area here has not done well on capital growth. In fact, it's reversed in real terms. The short-term growth from 17-18, so what I do is average the data from 2000, I get 2017 plus 18 data, 19 plus 20, divide by 2, it doubles my sample size. This area has declined in real terms by 27%. So if you had bought in that little patch, where here in the middle, where the demographics are rather distressed, let's say, then in real terms today, you'd be 27% down on the value of that asset. Now let's look at the 5-year capital growth. And this is inflation adjusted from 2017. It's postcode district data. So it's larger sample sizes, but it's actually recorded in a slightly different way to the other data. So the other data uses median prices, and this uses average prices. This one is slightly more susceptible to distortion. But anyway, the areas from the sample areas are bigger, so it all kind of works its way out. The upshot is anyway that had you bought this in 2017, you'd be 30% up in real terms. That's great. And if we look at the short-term picture, i.e. over the last year, how's that looking? Well, yeah, it's gone up by 8%. The question is, would it be a good investment buying around here? From a capital growth point of view, it would be, but there are other areas in Manchester which are doing much better and promise better growth in more distressed times. So if you work on the basis of the 10-year story, and we assume high inflation, a lot of disruption in the economy in the long term, would Ashton Under Lyne hold out? And my feeling is it probably wouldn't. So I'm going to give it a 3.5. I think it's got high risk capital growth, but as a sensible investor, what we're after is low risk capital growth. Now the next question is sales time. Like, how long does it take to sell in Ashton Under Lyne? And the answer is, let's bring that layer up here. And the answer is that it's a reasonably healthy market. So to explain this number here, 11% of property that's on the market gets sold each month. And in reality, what that means is you've got properties that go onto the market. They're in bad locations or whatever. People tend to just ignore them, and they hang around on the market for a very long time, like years sometimes. And then you have the properties which are hot and they get put under offer very quickly. And then you've got a 4-month completion period or whatever. So when you add it all up, 11% is healthy. So time to sell, reasonably healthy. I'm going to give that a 4 because I think it's doing all right, but it's not a very important variable. Time to rent. This is looking healthy. So 60% of the stock that's offered for rent in this particular area, will rent out. It will rent out per month. And what does that mean? Well, on average, then you're looking at 1.5 months. If it's a good property, it'll rent out in under a month. So broadly, I think that's fairly healthy. We don't have data for the town centres or for those kind of areas, but if you just look in the environs, it's like 60%, that kind of thing. So my feeling is that if you had a buy-to-let in one of the outlying areas that was sensibly priced, then I think you would rent it out fairly quickly. So I'm going to give it a reasonably good rent time, and I'm going to say 4 because I think it's healthy. Let's answer the question on yield. The way we analyze it is to get historic rent data, and then we run it through an algorithm which I built, and from there we make assumptions based on locality and property type and number of bedrooms. This data is from property data, it's like archive data, and we use it to help us make sense of the local property market. Anyhow, we can see here we've got a semi-detached house, and that's a 5.2% yield. It's based on the rent that we think a property in a place like this would achieve. And we can see here 5.5, 5.9, etc. I think as an area for yield, I think it's okay. But bear in mind, if we look at the areas which are good for buy-to-let, i.e. better demographic, and we go further out, then the reality is that the yields actually decline somewhat. So we're looking at 3.7, 3.5, etc. Overall, I would say it's not brilliant on yield, and I'm going to give it a 3.5 because whilst you can find sensibly yield property, i.e. above 5.2%, which is what will get you 75% loan to value, the problem is that the properties that you might want to buy tend to yield less. Now it's time to give the yield number a score, and I think overall it yields okay, but on balance, I think the properties that you might want to own as a buy-to-let landlord, where the demographics are good and the property stock is nice and all of those things, they're not yielding quite so well. Therefore, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. So let's see what the final score is. And it's a 3.2. That's okay. It's acceptable. But I just feel that you could do better than Ashton Under Lyne. I think Ashton Under Lyne is a reasonable place for buy-to-let. It's not by any means outstanding. So a 3 out of 5. That kind of says a lot, really. I think you could potentially find some interesting properties on the outskirts, but then the yield isn't so great. The long-term capital growth hasn't been particularly good. However, short-term growth has been. So the question is, will it carry on? My 10-year view is it's high inflation, it's a huge amount of economic disruption, and good areas will hold out and probably climb because the rich usually get richer in these kind of situations, and weaker areas will suffer badly. Therefore, I think my score of 3 out of 5 for Ashton Under Lyne is reasonable. I hope you found that helpful, and if you like, please like, and if you want to see more of this, do subscribe. Anyhow, until next time, good investing.